Welcome back to another week of the Hour of Grace. This week we are beginning our last Advent theme, and that is the theme of humility. This week is, as you probably know, the week of Christmas. And so on Christmas Eve, we're going to be celebrating here at church our Christmas Eve service, and we'd love to have you join us for that. It'll be posted online here as well, or if you're in the area and would like to join us in person, you can sign up on our website. That service is going to be at 5 o'clock in the evening. And if you're coming and you're going to join us in person, there's all the instructions that you'll need on our website for how to sign up and the precautions that we're taking to keep you safe while you're here. So as we think about humility and we move towards Christmas, I want us to look again at Isaiah chapter 40 and pay attention to the way in which God is described here as we think then about this week, the incarnation and the birth of Christ. Let's pray as we begin. God, as we open your word today, we ask for continued wisdom and insight into what it is that you have for us as we reflect on this theme of humility and the wonder of the incarnation. May our hearts be stirred to think of it anew and to be impacted by it and changed by it. Pray this in your name. Amen. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 40, we're going to pick up where we left off last week in verse 12. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales, and the hills in a balance? Who can fathom the Lord? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord, or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him, and who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding? So these verses here are speaking really to this comparison, or the incomparability of God. Who has measured the waters? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket? This obvious rhetorical question is no one but God. And as we begin this reflection on the humility of God, to pay attention to this language that is being used and this comparison that there is none who can compare to God. And then as we think on those things and reflect on that the author of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 2:17, for this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. And this reminder that none can compare to God, and yet there is none like him, and yet God has made himself like us. He had to become like us in every way, fully human, not just partially human, not just some pieces of him human, but this, as we talked about yesterday, this work of Christ that he has done and the incarnation, the miracle of the incarnation, is him becoming fully human. This God who no one is like has become like us. Continues, verse 15, surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. With whom will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? So again, we have this picture of the transcendence of God, that all of the sacrifices that could be offered cannot compare, are not enough to show the worth of God, that all that we bring in worship to him does not compare to what he is worthy of as God. He says the nations are like a drop in the bucket. Before him, verse 17 again, all the nations are nothing. And we hear these words, and as we talked about yesterday morning in our worship service, we hear these words, and then we hear the words of Paul in Philippians chapter 2. who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And this contrast, again, before him all the nations are nothing. And he made himself nothing. Again, this invitation that we have to see the vulnerability and the humility that God took upon himself to make himself nothing. You think about that, the emptiness of that word, nothing. He made himself nothing, but took on the nature of a servant. And that this, again, is the way that God has chosen to come to us. The verse continues, verse 18. With whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? As for an idol, a metal worker casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and fashions silver chains for it. A person too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. They look for a skilled worker to set up an idol that will not topple. So you then have a further question. Who can compare to God? What possible image this God who makes the nations nothing, this God who measures out the earth and weighs it in his scales, this God who holds it all together, how can you possibly form an image? How could you possibly form an idol that would represent this God? This God is not able to be represented in form, and so it gives this picture of somebody trying to form out of these natural objects that are created by God, this representation, some kind of representation of who this God is. And the question and the answer to the rhetorical question again is no one. You can't. Any kind of idol, any kind of image would pale in comparison to this God. And yet Paul again tells us in Colossians that Christ, that this man, the Son, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So Paul here is saying what Isaiah is saying, right? He's saying, he's giving us this picture of God holding all of creation together and being the author, and certainly no one can compare to him. And yet he also is saying that this human, Jesus, is the image of this invisible God. This God that no one can create an image of has made an image of himself, has revealed himself in an image. But the image is not an idol, and it's not a calf or some other kind of thing fashioned out of wood or gold or bronze or any precious materials. But it's an image fashioned out of flesh and blood. He's a human, and this God has made himself to be human. Put himself, this God who said, "Do not make an image of me," has made an image of himself, and it is this person, Jesus. Verse 21, do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground, than he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. It's been so interesting to read this chapter of Isaiah in the context of Christmas. Any other time that we would be reading this passage, in any other time of the year, the overwhelming reality is this greatness, this power, this might of God. And as we think about the way in which we come and worship and the songs that we typically sing about God, this is the truth that we are often expressing. But this one time of the year, we focus on something different. And we emphasize this humility. And so this passage that says all people are like grasshoppers, this is how we often feel in relationship to God. And this feels appropriate. And yet the story of Christmas, the story that we are reflecting on this time, is that God becomes like one of the grasshoppers. And we focus on this time of year, and it's so important. And I think this is where some of the wonder of this season certainly lands on us, is this humility of God and this movement that God has away from his greatness towards his vulnerability and his humility. This idea that God is bringing princes to naught, and yet he, as a child, places himself in such a place of vulnerability that he is at the whims of these princes and kings, and that it's only by the willingness of Joseph and Mary to follow the direction of the angel to flee to Egypt that his life is spared, and that God's plans have come to such a vulnerability and such a surrender to other human beings to care for him, to provide for him, to ensure his safety. We don't know how much this baby Jesus actually was aware of what was going on. As I read the passages that we've already looked at, the one from Hebrews that talk about how he became like us in every way, I have to imagine that there was a point in his humanity where he was unaware of his surroundings and what was going on around him just as much as any other infant would be. Just looking for food and sleep and those basic needs that any child would. And to think that in this vulnerability and the forces of evil that are trying to stop God's plan, and the Herods that are seeking to destroy his life, God has put himself in this place of weakness. And so this leads us really to the other aspect of this theme of humility that we focus on this week, that as we acknowledge, as we pay attention to the humility of God who made himself nothing, there's also this invitation that we see again in the story from the shepherds, from the Magi, this invitation to come and worship as well, and to recognize that the God that we worship is certainly a God like what Isaiah is talking about here in Isaiah chapter 40, that none can compare to, but he is also a God who has made himself nothing. And we worship this aspect of him as well. We worship not just his greatness, but also his weakness and his humility. And it is hard to wrap our minds around what that could possibly mean. But like the Magi who come and bow before a baby, we are invited to come and to worship God in both his greatness and his weakness. So as we begin this week and we focus on the humility and we move towards Christmas, focusing on the incarnation of Christ, we are going to continue to focus on these themes and this reality and this contrast between both the greatness of God and his humility. We'd love to have you join us once again for our Christmas Eve service on Thursday night. That's going to be at 5 p.m. Pacific time, and looking forward to worshiping with you for that as well.